When I was 4 years old, I killed someone. And 43 years later, I received the Ahimsa Award for my work on global nonviolence. Of course, on that fateful day in 1970, I had no idea that my actions would set me on a journey of discovery that would transform the way I understood and related to myself and the world, and that would lead me to write award-winning books and establish an international NGO to help others experience similar transformation. It was a hot summer day, and I was with my parents on my father's fishing boat, my favorite place in the world to be. And then I caught my first fish. My parents clapped and laughed and told me how proud they were, but I felt confused and distraught. I didn't understand why I couldn't share their happiness. As I watched the fish I'd pulled out of the ocean flop on the floor of the boat, gasping for air, all I could feel was sadness and guilt. After that day, my father's boat, which had once been a source of joy, became a trigger for distress. And seafood, which I had loved, sickened me to the point where I could no longer eat it without vomiting. My emotions and body were reacting to a paradox that my young brain wasn't developed enough to understand. I couldn't reconcile how caring people, my own parents at that, could harm others and neither see nor feel troubled by this contradiction. My parents had instilled in me a strong commitment to practicing the golden rule, to treating others the way I'd want to be treated if I were in their position. So had my teachers, the ministers at our church, and just about every adult who influenced my development. Yet it seemed like everywhere I turned, this supposedly highest principle was being violated, and nobody was the least bit concerned. What I didn't realize at that time was that this directive to relate to others with respect wasn't just some lofty ideal. Many years later, my research led me to understand that it held the key to personal and social transformation. When you think about some of the most serious problems, not only in our personal lives, but also in the world, such as domestic abuse, self-harm, war, poverty, racism, patriarchy, animal exploitation, and climate change, you can see that they all share a common denominator, which is relational dysfunction, or dysfunctional ways of relating to other individuals, between social groups, to other animals and the environment, and even to ourselves. So healthy ways of relating, relational function, is the common denominator in transforming all of these problems. And healthy relating is based on a simple formula. This formula applies to all dimensions and kinds of relationships. It applies to the collective dimension, how social groups relate, the interpersonal dimension, how two or several individuals relate, and to the intrapersonal dimension, how we relate to ourselves. It also applies to how we relate to other animals in the environment. The formula applies equally to brief interactions and long-term relationships. Relationships are, after all, a series of interactions. And of course, it applies to how we communicate, since communication is the primary way we relate. So here's the formula. In a healthy relationship or interaction, we practice integrity and honor dignity, and this leads to a sense of connection and security. Integrity is the integration of the core moral values of compassion and justice and behaviors. It's treating others with respect. Dignity is one's sense of inherent worth. When we honor someone's dignity, we perceive and treat them as no less worthy of respect than anyone else. Of course, healthy relating, like most things in life, is not an either-or phenomenon. It exists on a spectrum. On the healthy side of the spectrum are relational attitudes and behaviors. On the dysfunctional side are non-relational attitudes and behaviors. Non-relational attitudes and behaviors violate integrity, harm dignity, and lead to a sense of disconnection and insecurity. And not only can our communication and other ways of interacting be more or less healthy or relational, so can the systems of which we're a part. It was more than 3 decades after I killed the fish that my research led me to discover that there's a specific mentality at the core of all oppressive and abusive behaviors, whether the behaviors are directed toward human or non-human beings. This mentality causes us to think and therefore to feel and act in ways that are non-relational and that ultimately bring about the opposite outcomes of what we want. We inherit this non-relational mentality from various systems that we're a part of, and we act on it and reproduce it without realizing that we're doing so. It compels us to indirectly support or directly engage in a range of harmful behaviors, from those that enable global atrocities to those that undermine the sense of security and connection in our interpersonal relationships. At the far non-relational end of the relational health spectrum, the behaviors are abusive and the systems are oppressive. These oppressive systems are those such as patriarchy, racism, classism, and what I call carnism, the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. Also included here are smaller systems like abusive family systems and workplaces. The non-relational mentality is based on the belief in a hierarchy of moral worth, that some individuals or groups are more worthy of moral consideration, of being treated with respect than others. When we buy into this belief, we tend to wield power over others in order to satisfy our own desires, which leads to unjust power imbalances between individuals and among groups. So I sometimes refer to non-relational systems as powerarchies. On the opposite end of the relational health spectrum are behaviors and systems that are based on the recognition of the inherent dignity of all beings. And rather than create unjust power imbalances, they lead to a balance of power. When an interaction or system is more relational, it's more resilient, better able to withstand and bounce back from stress. So why do we so often fail to practice the formula, acting against what we could call our better or more evolved natures? One reason is that we're hardwired to engage in certain non-relational behaviors, which had evolutionary benefits, helping keep us and our in-groups safe. And most of us have never learned how to relate healthfully. Plus, non-relational systems condition us to think and act in ways that keep them intact. But research shows that we're also hardwired to feel empathy and to seek meaningful connections with others, and that the ability to form secure connections is the basis of healthy human development and of psychological and relational resilience. Research also shows that we strive to live in alignment with our moral values. Plus, we've evolved such that we can often interrupt our instinctive reactions to improve our outcomes. So during a heated argument with your partner, even though the more primal part of your brain may make you feel compelled to whack them, your modern mind enables you to put the brakes on that compulsion and even act in ways that restore rather than further erode your connection. When we behave non-relationally, supporting non-relational systems, we're acting against our natural empathy and drive for connection and our moral values. So, to maintain themselves, these systems use psychological defense mechanisms to distort our perceptions so that we think and behave non-relationally without realizing what we're doing. I identified these defense mechanisms while researching the psychology of eating animals for my doctoral dissertation, a project that laid the groundwork for my broader analysis of non-relational systems. I was inspired to investigate this particular topic after a contaminated hamburger I'd eaten landed me in the hospital. I emerged from that experience vowing never to eat meat again for fear of a repeat bacterial performance. As I was learning how to cook vegetarian food, I stumbled upon information about the consequences of animal agriculture on farmed animals, the environment, and human health, and I became vegan, only to discover that when I tried to share what I learned with others, they reacted defensively. They'd say things like, "Don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal," or they'd call me a crazy vegan hippie propagandist. My research on the psychology of eating animals led me to identify carnism, the system that conditions us to think and act non-relationally toward those animals we've learned to classify as edible, without recognizing the inconsistencies in our attitudes and behaviors. For example, Imagine that as you're biting into a juicy hamburger, your dining companion tells you that the burger isn't actually made from beef, but from a golden retriever. Chances are, what you just saw as food, you now see as a dead animal. What you just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And rather than continue eating the burger, you probably want to throw it in the trash. Carnism has distorted your perception of cows, but not dogs. So you see cow flesh as food, and you act accordingly. When non-relational systems are dominant social systems like carnism or racism or heterosexism or patriarchy, their defense mechanisms are woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, and so forth. So when we study nutrition, for example, we actually study carnistic nutrition. Just as when 20th century psychology students studied psychology, they actually studied heterosexist psychology. All non-relational systems use the same kinds of psychological defense mechanisms. The difference is simply who and what they distort our perceptions about. Non-relational systems also use privileges to maintain themselves. They give special advantages to one individual or group while disadvantaging others to help ensure that power doesn't balance out. Research has shown that non-relational attitudes and behaviors are contagious. As long as we're unaware of them, we're likely to recreate them. Even those of us who are working to create a more relational world can end up reinforcing the very problem we're trying to transform. The infighting in some social justice groups is causing them to cannibalize themselves. Personal and social transformation isn't possible if we keep our focus limited to the content. Who is oppressing or abusing whom? We need to understand and address the process, how and why we oppress and abuse in the first place. If we want to create a healthier world for everyone, we need to change the way we relate. The good news is that just as non-relational attitudes and behaviors are contagious, relational attitudes and behaviors are also contagious. The fish I killed was the first of two individuals who shaped the trajectory of my life's work. The second was my dog Fritz, who I grew up with. The fish was my first relational casualty, and Fritz was my first friend. The fish taught me what it felt like to perpetrate relational dysfunction. Fritz taught me what it felt like to practice relational health. My relationships with these two animals led me to recognize both the meta problem facing our world, relational dysfunction, and the meta solution to this problem, relational literacy, the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. And I realized that all of us who are working towards social transformation have the same meta mission, to create a more relational world. Obviously, relational literacy isn't the only solution to our problems, but it's foundational to all other solutions. Despite the importance of relational literacy, most of us don't recognize its value, nor are we given the opportunity to build it. It's striking that most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use, and yet we don't get a single formal lesson in how to relate in a way that's healthy. And many of the most pressing problems in our world and personal lives are not caused by people who don't know how to do geometry. If our collective level of relational literacy weren't so low, if we weren't still living in the relational dark ages, we wouldn't elect relationally dysfunctional leaders or vote for relationally harmful policies. Building relational literacy is perhaps especially important for those working to transform non-relational systems and behaviors. When social justice movements are more relational and therefore more resilient, they're more powerful. When I think back to that day I killed the fish, I always remember the quote by Bradley Miller. Teaching a child not to step on a caterpillar is almost as valuable to the child as it is to the caterpillar. At Beyond Carnism, our mission is to expose and transform carnism and to create a more impactful vegan movement, which we work toward in large part through our Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy. And because we recognize that relational dysfunction is the meta problem that gives rise to carnism and other intersecting problems, and that weakens the vegan movement, our meta mission is to help create a more relational world. Through awareness raising and training, we work to create a better world for all beings.